Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a film that, well, I think safe to say it needs no introduction.
Gladiator.
Gladiator it is.
Yeah.
Even with Gladiator to second about to hit theaters, the original from 2000 still has people talking. And we've got a ton of material to dig into, production notes, reviews from back in the day, and even some historical analyses to see how well fact lines up with fiction.
Should be fun to separate the two.
Exactly. So before we get lost in the weeds, let's do a quick recap for anyone who hasn't seen the film recently. Gladiator follows Maximus Decimus Meridius, a Roman general who's betrayed and ends up a slave. His journey from battlefield to, well, gladiatorial arena. That's really the heart of the story.
It's such a powerful story because it blends that personal revenge tale with these bigger ideas about power, corruption, even the fall of empires.
Totally. It's not just about Maximus's survival, right? It's about Rome itself, the soul of Rome. And you can't talk about Gladiator without talking about his cast, starting with Russell Crowe as Maximus. He just embodies that character's strength, but also the tragedy of it all.
Oh, absolutely. His performance is iconic. Hard to picture anyone else as Maximus now. But, originally Mel Gibson and Tom Cruise were considered for the role.
Wow, really? Now that you mention it, I could see Mel Gibson bringing that, like, rough around the edges energy to Maximus. Almost an anti-hero vibe. Speaking of shifting the tone, we've got to talk about Joaquin Phoenix as Commodus. He's terrifying, no doubt, but sometimes you almost feel for him. He's such a complex villain.
His audition tape was apparently incredible. It just blew everyone away. He managed to bring this vulnerability to Commodus, a tortured soul beneath all the cruelty. It makes him even more disturbing, I think.
Absolutely. And then there's Connie Nielsen as Lucilla, Commodus' sister. She's caught in the middle, trying to balance loyalty to her family with her conscience.
Such a nuanced performance, too. It really highlights how women in ancient Rome had to maneuver within a system dominated by men and their ambitions. And her role actually has some really interesting historical parallels. The real Lucilla was involved in a plot against her brother, shows how women could wield power even behind the scenes.
That's fascinating. So we've got these powerhouse actors bringing the characters to life, but let's talk about the production itself. Gladiator is just epic in scale. Those massive sets, the battle sequences, it's filmmaking on a grand level.
Right, and Ridley Scott, the director, he's known for his attention to detail. Even the filming locations, they weren't just random choices. Like, they used Bourne Wood in England for those opening battle scenes in Germania.
I read that Scott got permission to actually burn down part of the forest to make it look authentic.
Oh, wow. Yeah. He was committed to getting that realism, that brutality of ancient warfare. And you see that in the way he films the battles, too. He uses techniques like this 45-degree shutter thing to give it almost a documentary feel.
Okay, for those of us who aren't film experts, what exactly does the 45-degree shutter do?
So basically, shutter speed controls how long the camera shutter stays open. Faster speeds make the action crisp and clear. But a slower speed, like the 45-degree shutter, that creates a slight blurring. It's like how our eyes might see something happening super fast.
Oh, that makes sense. So Scott's really pulling us into the chaos of the battle. And I read that he used similar techniques in Saving Private Ryan to capture the D-Day landing.
Exactly. It makes it feel more immediate, more authentic. You're right there in the action. And speaking of behind-the-scenes stuff, did you know that filming for Gladiator actually started without a finished script?
Yeah, I read about that. Apparently, they only had like 32 pages to work with at the beginning. Hard to believe considering how big and complex the final film is.
Right. And word is Russell Crowe even butted heads with the writer William Nicholson sometimes. But maybe that creative tension is what led to some of those memorable moments.
It's interesting how sometimes that on-set chaos can lead to something amazing.
Yeah.
And I guess having a script that was, evolving, let the actors have more input, really shape their characters.
And that definitely comes through in their performances. You feel the depth of the characters. It's not just reciting lines. Even the supporting roles, like Jimon Hansu as Juba, they stick with you. They make the film so much richer emotionally.
It's a true ensemble piece, which I think elevates it beyond just a revenge story. It becomes about brotherhood, loyalty, finding that humanity in the most brutal setting.
Oh, for sure. And speaking of brutal, those scenes in the arena, man, they're thrilling, but they're intense. Scott doesn't hold back on showing how violent these contests were.
Totally. And there's that scene with Maximus facing tigers in the Colosseum. I've always wondered, did they use real tigers for that?
So it's a mix, actually. They used real tigers and dummies and then combined it with CGI to keep everyone safe. Really clever way to do it.
I can't even imagine the logistics of that. It's amazing what they were able to pull off, but not everything went smoothly, right? Oliver Reed, who played Proximo, he passed away during filming.
Yeah, that was a huge loss for the production. They had to rewrite the ending and use digital effects to recreate some of his scenes. It's really fitting that the film's dedicated to his memory.
It is. It reminds us that even behind these big epic films, there are real people and real stories.
Now, before we go any further, we should probably address, the historical accuracy, or maybe the lack thereof, in Gladiator.
Right, right. It's not exactly a documentary. I mean, just for starters, Marcus Aurelius didn't die by Commodus's hand. It was the Antonine Plague that got him.
Yeah, and there's no evidence that Marcus Aurelius actually wanted to bring back the Roman Republic. It's a cool idea for the story, but not historically accurate.
It's like they took bits and pieces of history and kind of molded it to fit their narrative. Even Maximus, our hero, he's completely fictional, though some people say he might be loosely based on, like, a Spartacus-type figure.
Yeah, maybe. But I think even with those changes, those historical inaccuracies, it raises a good question. Do those things actually make the film less powerful? Or maybe by streamlining the story, by focusing on these, emotional truths, does it actually make it more powerful?
That's a really interesting point. It might not be a straight-up history lesson, but it still gets at something very human, very real. And that leads to all the themes that are woven through the film beneath all the action and the spectacle.
One of the biggest themes, of course, is the corrupting influence of power. You see it with Commodus. He's just consumed by ambition, by wanting to control everything and everyone. He'll do anything, even betray and murder, to get what he wants.
He's almost like a warning of what not to do when it comes to power. And it's interesting, that theme, it still feels relevant today. We're still dealing with these issues of power and the fight for justice.
Definitely. It's one of the things that makes Gladiator timeless. It's not just a historical epic. It's about the human condition, this age-old struggle between good and evil. And then you have Maximus, who's kind of the opposite of Commodus. He represents honor, duty, putting others before himself. Even when everything's been taken from him, he holds on to his integrity.
He doesn't want power for himself. He wants a better Rome, a more just Rome. It's almost like this utopian ideal, a leader who truly serves the people.
Exactly. And his journey, it shows us that even in the darkest times, there's still hope, still resilience. Think about what he goes through, becoming a slave, forced to fight for his life. But he never really gives up. His spirit doesn't break.
He finds freedom, even while being, completely constrained. And it's not just physical freedom, right? It's like a spiritual freedom, too. Freeing himself from hatred and revenge, those things that could eat him alive.
Absolutely. That inner struggle is what makes his character so compelling. He wants revenge, but he also realizes that giving into that hatred, it'll destroy him in the end. And that leads to one of the most powerful scenes. When he shows mercy, he chooses to make sure Rome has a just future, instead of just taking revenge for himself.
That scene is so moving, it really gets you. It's about rising above your instincts, doing what's right for something bigger than yourself. And there's this recurring image of wheat throughout the film. It seems to represent, like, peace, home, those memories of his family and his life before everything fell apart.
Oh, yeah. You see it in the flashbacks and then those almost dreamlike sequences where he imagines the afterlife, being reunited with his loved ones in these golden fields of wheat. It's like this visual representation of his longing for peace, for a world without violence.
And it's such a stark contrast visually, too, right? The golden wheat fields all bathed in light compared to the darkness and the brutality of the Colosseum.
Right. The Colosseum itself, it's more than just a setting. It becomes this symbol of Rome's power and cruelty, this place where human life is just entertainment.
It's like its own character almost, this imposing structure that looms over everything that's happening.
And then you have those sweeping shots of the Roman countryside, all those sun-drenched hills. It's like the filmmakers are contrasting the natural world with the man-made world of the Roman Empire, this world that's full of corruption and ambition.
And speaking of contrasts, we can't forget the music, right? That score by Hans Zimmer and Lisa Gerrard, it's just incredible. Those big orchestral pieces mixed with those almost ancient-sounding vocals, it just fits perfectly with the story.
It's so good. It really adds to the emotional impact of those key scenes, Maximus's struggle, those tense gladiator battles, even those ethereal afterlife scenes.
It's haunting, It stays with you long after the movie's over. Didn't the score cause some controversy, though?
Oh, yeah. Some people said that Zimmer borrowed a little too much from Gustav Holst's The Planets. There was even a lawsuit from the Holst Foundation.
No way. I didn't know that. It's a reminder that even in a film like Gladiator, which feels so original, there are still artistic influences at play. And some critics have even pointed out similarities between Gladiator and that older film from 1964, The Fall of the Roman Empire. They both deal with power struggles in Rome during Marcus Aurelius's reign.
Yeah, I can see the similarities, but I think Gladiator still stands on its own. It has a different perspective, it's more personal and emotional, and those visuals, they're just breathtaking. It's a different kind of film.
And it's a film that has really seeped into popular culture. That line, "Are you not entertained?" Right? Everyone knows that line, even if they haven't seen the film.
Totally. And Gladiator really sparked this renewed interest in ancient Rome, all those sword and sandal epics. It inspired a whole bunch of filmmakers to try and capture that same, grand scale and spectacle of the
But
past.
it went beyond just film, right?
Yeah.
Remember all the gladiator chic that was everywhere after the movie came out? Those strappy sandals, the leather, even those Roman-inspired hairstyles, a whole fashion trend.
It's crazy how a film can have that kind of impact, from fashion to how we view history. And now, after more than 2 decades, we're getting Gladiator 2. It just shows you the staying power of that original film. The world Ridley Scott created, the characters, those themes, they still resonate with people today.
It does make you wonder how they'll approach the story, though, because, Maximus's story, it had a pretty definitive ending.
I know, right? It'll be interesting to see how they handle that. I read that it's going to focus on Lucius, Lucilla's son, years after the events of the first film. So it's a chance to explore a new part of that world, but maybe with some of those same themes, those same struggles that made Gladiator so good.
And they've got some big names attached. Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, Pedro Pascal. Sounds like a mix of, up-and-coming talent and established stars. I bet this sequel is going to be a big talking point.
I'm sure it will. It just shows how powerful that first thing is, that it's still sparking these conversations, these new creative projects, even after all these years.
Before we move on to the legacy of Gladiator and wrap things up, I think we should take a minute to appreciate Lucilla. She's often kind of overlooked.
Oh, she is. She's often overshadowed by Maximus and Commodus, but she's really important. She's the moral center of the film, stuck making these impossible choices in a world ruled by men.
She's torn between loyalty to her family and this desire for justice. And you could argue she's the one who sets Maximus on his path.
Totally. If it weren't for her, he wouldn't have escaped. He wouldn't have had the chance to stand up to Commodus, to fight for a better Rome. It shows that even those who seem powerless, they can still make a difference.
Okay, so we've talked about the plot, the characters, the historical context, the themes, even the fashion that Gladiator inspired. But as we wrap up, what do you think is the film's biggest legacy? What's it left us with?
It's interesting to think about how a fictional story can shape how we see history. Gladiator really brought ancient Rome back into the spotlight. I mean, a whole new generation was introduced to Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, even the idea of the Roman Republic.
And all those images, the Colosseum, the gladiator's armor, those sweeping shots of the Roman Empire, they've almost become like the standard images we think of when we think of that time period.
Totally. And even if those images aren't 100% accurate, historically speaking, the film blends fact and fiction in such a compelling way that it's influenced how we imagine, how we remember ancient Rome.
And it's not just history buffs, right? Gladiator has had a huge impact on filmmaking itself, especially in those action and historical epic genres.
For sure. The way they use slow motion and CGI in those battle scenes, it was groundbreaking back then. It set a new bar for epic films. You can see its influence in movies like 300, Kingdom of Heaven, even Lord of the Rings to some extent.
I could definitely see that. But it's not just about the spectacle. It's the emotional core of Gladiator that resonates. That revenge story mixed with honor, duty, the fight for justice. Those themes, they've stuck with audiences and filmmakers.
Absolutely. And, well, speaking of its influence, here we are over 20 years later, and we're getting Gladiator 2. The fact that they're making a sequel, it really says something about how powerful that original film is. Ridley Scott created a world that still captures people's imaginations.
It does make you wonder, though, where they're going to go with the story. I mean, Maximus's story, that had a pretty clear ending.
Right. It'll be interesting to see how they handle that. I've heard that it's going to focus on Lucius, Lucilla's son, and it takes place years after the first film. So it's like a new chapter in that world, but maybe with some echoes of those themes, those conflicts that made Gladiator so good.
And they've got a great cast: Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, Pedro Pascal. A good mix of new faces and Hollywood legends. I have a feeling the sequel is going to be a big deal. A lot of people are going to have opinions.
I'm sure of it. It just goes to show how much that first film still matters. It's sparking new conversations, new creative projects, even after all this time.
You know, thinking back on this deep dive, it's funny how my own view of Gladiator has changed over the years.
Mm.
When I first saw it, I was just blown away by the action, the visuals, the sheer scale of it all.
Yeah, I get that. It's a visually stunning film. Those battle scenes are hard to forget. But it sounds like you've discovered some of the deeper layers too.
I have. Now I find myself really drawn to those quiet moments, the exploration of those big themes, how complex the characters are, and the way it uses history as a starting point for a story that's both, like, epic and incredibly personal.
That's what I love about revisiting films, you know? We bring new experiences to each viewing. We see things we didn't see before. In Gladiator, it's a film with so much to unpack. There's always something new to discover.
This deep dive has been a great reminder of that. It's not just about, summarizing the plot or listing off trivia. It's about really engaging with the film, questioning what we think we know, finding new ways to connect with a story that's touched so many people for so long.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as we all get ready to see Gladiator second, I hope you keep all this in mind. Think about how the sequel connects to the original. What new perspectives does it bring?
That's a great point. It's not just about seeing a new film. It's a chance to go back to the original, to see how those characters, those themes, still speak to us in new ways.
Exactly. And remember, the journey doesn't end when the credits roll. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and, well, keep those deep dives going.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode. We'll be back soon with another topic, ready to explore new worlds and discover new depths. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.